Hello everyone, Stephanie from DesignCode. Welcome to this 3-part tutorial about Apollo GraphQL, where we'll learn the complete flow to install Apollo GraphQL, fetch and process the data, and display it in our view. So what is Apollo GraphQL? It's a platform that lets you do API calls using GraphQL. GraphQL is a query language for your API and it's really easy to learn. If you don't know GraphQL, you can simply head over to graphql.org and click on Learn to learn how to use this query language. So Apollo GraphQL is the modern way to fetch data because it deals with asynchronous fetching and only fetches the data that you really need. Therefore, there won't be unnecessary data that takes up unnecessary space in your application, and it will also load faster. The first thing we will need to do is install Apollo into our SwiftUI application. To do so, head over to the Apollo iOS GitHub repository, and you can find the link in the text content of this section. Next, I will click on Code, and I will copy this link here. Then we head over to our Xcode project, click on Apollo GraphQL, and then our project here. Under Swift Packages, we will click the plus sign and paste the link that we just copied. We'll click on Next, and in here, as per Apollo's documentation, we will select up to next minor. Then click on Next, and it will fetch everything from the GitHub repository. Once it's fetched, you can select the packages that you want. So we will only select the first one, which is Apollo, and we'll click on Finish. So now we have the Apollo package in our SwiftUI application. Once you have the Apollo package in your Xcode project, you will need to add a schema. Because in order to run your query, Apollo requires a schema.json file. You can download your schema by downloading the Apollo CLI. You can simply follow this comment here and it will download it for you. Next, you will need to download the actual schema. So we will simply open our terminal and make sure that you are under your project folder. In here, you will do Apollo schema download, and then you need to provide an endpoint. The endpoint is where your schema is located. In this tutorial, we will use a schema that is already provided by Apollo GraphQL. So we will use this one here. So we'll just copy this link and then paste it here. And the last thing you'll need to add in this comment is the name of the file. So as I said before, Apollo requires a schema.json file, so we'll name it schema.json. Then you hit enter, and as you can see, it loaded the Apollo project and saved the schema to schema.json. If you go back to your Xcode project, you will see that the file is not in your project. So you will right-click on Shared, add files to your project, and you will see that you will have the schema.json file inside of the folder. So you simply double click on this and it will add it to your project. Next, we'll need to create a GraphQL query to fetch the data. So you can use this here to test your queries and to make sure that you do get some data back. For example, I already have my query here and I can click on play, and as you can see, I have data here. So we will copy this query, go back to our Xcode project and create a new file. So new file, and we'll scroll down to empty. In here, we will give the name of our query. So we'll call it launchlist.graphql. So this is a GraphQL type file, so it only takes GraphQL queries. So I will paste the query that I copied, and you can also find it in the text content of this section. It's important to note that Apollo requires that each query has a unique name. So it's important to add a name after the query keyword here. Once you have your GraphQL query, we will need to add a code generation build phase. So click on your project and select the target that you want to pinpoint. So in our case, we're only focusing on the iOS app. So we'll click on iOS and then go to build phases, click on the plus sign and add a new run script phase. Let's rename this to generate Apollo GraphQL API. Then we will need to move this script just after dependencies and after the compile sources. Let's open the script, and you can find the script that we will add in this step in the text content of this section. So I will paste it here, and on line 22, you will need to specify the path to your schema.json file. In our case, it is in the root folder, but it's not under the target name. It will be under the shared folder. Once you do that, you simply build your application. So the first time that it will build, it will always fail because Apollo GraphQL wasn't able to find the API.swift file. Once you build it a second time, it will succeed, and you can drag and drop or right-click on the shared folder, add new files to Apollo GraphQL, and then simply select the API.swift file. So we can try to build it again. And as you can see, the build succeeded. So congratulations! We just installed Apollo GraphQL into our application, and we're ready to move on to the next part of this 3-part tutorial, where we'll start working with the data. Also, to make the previews work, remember to check this, because if not, the previews will always pause. Remember to uncheck it every time that you add a new query or that you want to update the API.swift file. In the first section of this 3-part tutorial about GraphQL, we left off after generating our API.swift file and adding it into our Xcode project. If you haven't, simply build your application again and then drag and drop it into your Xcode project. Remember that this file is automatically generated and should never be edited as stated here, because if you edit it, it will lead to bugs in your application because Apollo won't be able to fetch your data with the queries that you added in your project. The next thing that we will need to do is to create our network call. So under the shared folder, I will right-click and then add a new file. It will be a Swift file, and we will call it network. Inside of here, we will import Apollo and then create a class called network. Inside of that class, we will create a shared instance of network. So static let shared will be equals to network. Then we are defining a URL. So the URL will be a string for now, and it is a string to your API. Since for this tutorial we are using this API from Apollo GraphQL, we will simply copy this link and paste it in here. Then we need to create a Apollo instance. So private set lazyvar Apollo will be equals to Apollo client, and we need to provide a URL. So we'll create a URL from the string that we created on line 14, so URL. Now that we created our network, we need to create a view model. A view model allows you to process your data before displaying it in a view. And it also makes your code cleaner because it's easier to read and you separate the functions from the UI. So we will right-click on the shared folder, create a new file. It will be a Swift file, and we will call it launch view model. In here, we will create a new class called launch view model, which will conform to an observable object. And we will create a function that will fetch the data. Inside of this function, we will call our network class that we just created, then we will call the shared instance, and then call apollo.fetch, and we need to provide a query. So the query that we created was the launch list query. So we will simply do launch list query. And what we get in return is a result. So we can create a switch statement in here, and we will check the result. If it's a success, we will rename the result that we get to GraphQL result. If it's a success, we will print success and the result. So GraphQL result. In the case that it's a failure, we will get an error. So we will also print the error. Failure, error, 2 dots, and we'll print the actual error. Next, we will need to initialize our launch view model as a state object in our app file. So navigate to your project name app.swift. Then in here, we will create a state object var launch view model will be equals to launch view model. Then you'll need to attach it as an environment object to content view, and you can pass in this variable here. Back in our launch view model, we will call the init function here, and on init of this launch view model, we will call the fetch function. So every time that our launch view model is initialized, which is initialized in the app level, it will fetch the data for us. So now we will run our application by either doing Command Shift R or simply going to Product and Build for Running. So it will build your application, and if everything is good, it will print our GraphQL result here. It took some time after the launch of our application, but as you can see, we have success and we have the result here. The next thing we need to do is to create our model. So under the shared folder, I will right-click, create a new file. It will be a Swift file, and let's call it launch model. So a model is where you define your app's data types. Storing the models outside of the view makes your code cleaner and more readable, and it's also easier to test. Following Apollo's launch playground schema, we will build our launch type structure. So luckily, I already created the launch model for you, so you can find it in the text content of this section. So I will simply paste it here. Now that we have our model, we need to process the data that we get from our fetch function here. So let's create a published variable, var launches, which will be of type launches.launch, and we will initialize it as an empty array. So the launches, it's an array of launch from our launch model that we created here. Next, we need to create a function that will process the data that we get from GraphQL. We will pass an argument that will be data, and it will be launch data. And this function will return an array of launches.launch, which is the same data type as our variable here. The only thing we need to do in this function is to return launches with a capital L, and we'll pass in the data, and we want the actual launches. So in the fetch function, we will need to change it a bit. So I will remove this print here and paste the code that you can find in the text content of this section. So in this if statement, we are checking that we do have some data in our GraphQL result and assign it to a local launches variable inside of this function. Then we are processing the data with the process function here to turn the data that we get from the GraphQL result into a Swift data type that we will be able to manipulate in our view. And if there is an error, we will print the error. In the last section, we created two functions in our launch view model. One function is to fetch the data from our API, and then the second one is to process the data into our launch data type so that we can easily use it in our view. To display the data that we get from our API, let's go to Content View. In Content View, we will add an environment object, var launch view model, which will be of launch view model type. Remember to also add the environment object to the preview so that it will work. So launch view model. Then we will remove the text here and create a scroll view. Inside of the scroll view, we will iterate over the launches variable that we created in our launch view model. So we'll do for each, and we'll call our launch view model.launches. And what we get in return is a launch here. So for now, let's only display the ID of each launch. So as you can see, I have all the IDs of all my launches here. So it ranges from 90 to 109. This is good if we only want to display one single information. However, to make our code cleaner, we will make a component, and the component will be a launch card. So under the shell folder, I will right-click and create a new file. It will be a SwiftUI view, and let's call it launch card. This component will require an argument. It will be a launch. So the launch is of launches.launch type. And as you can see, there's an error for the preview here. So let's comment it out just for now, and we'll come back to it later. Let's wrap our text in a VStack, and we'll display the launch.id as well as the launch.site. So instead of displaying a text here, we will display our launch card, and we need to pass in a launch. So it will be the launch that we're iterating over. If we click on resume here, you can see that the preview pauses a lot. So to fix this, you simply need to go to Apollo GraphQL, and under the generate Apollo GraphQL script that we just added, we will check the for install builds only. So let's go back to Content View and resume our preview. So as you can see, I have my launch card that displays our launch ID and the site here. Now that we know that we passed the right data to our launch card, we can make the preview here work. So let's uncomment this. As you can see, the error is that we're missing argument for parameter launch because the launch card for the preview doesn't have any launch variable. So we need to pass one. Let's create a local launch only for the preview here. So I will create a new file. It will be a Swift file, and let's call it load from file. So in this file, I will paste the load function that is taken from the data from JSON section of this handbook. You can head over to the data from JSON section of this handbook to learn how to load data from a JSON file. I will create another file, so new file. It will be an empty file, and we will call it launch_data.json. And I copied the launch data that you can find in the text content of this section. So this is a preview data for one launch. Let's go back to load function from file and create a launch preview, which will be of launches.launch type, and we will load our launch data.json. Then in launch card, we will pass our launch, which will be launch preview. So let's resume this, and you will see that we have the ID and we have the launch site of our launch preview data that we added here. So I styled my launch card a little bit and added more information on each of the launch cards. You can style it however you want and display all the information that you want in your card. To add new information to your card, you can create a text and then write launch dot, and it will suggest you all the information that you can add to your card. So let's say we want to add rocket.id. So as you can see here, the ID of my rocket is Falcon 9. So the autocomplete suggests you these results because we created our launch model here, and because we process our data into this launch data model, so we can easily use it in our views. So this is how you display the data that you get from Apollo GraphQL. I hope that you learned something new in this video, and don't hesitate to head over to all the other sections of this SwiftUI handbook to learn more about other topics on SwiftUI.